Our final paper from this session is from Matthew Churchward, and Matthew will be covering the topic Designing Roads for the Automobile Age, re-examining the work of William Calder and the science of good roads. Can you join me in welcoming Matthew?
Lovely. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. So from the modern suburban sprawl of car parks, I want to take you back to the start of the automobile age, back in the first decade of the 20th century. Most of you probably would have heard of William Calder. He's best known today as the founding chairman of the Country Roads Board of Victoria. Also the person who gave their name to the Calder Highway in the northwest of the state. But before he became the chair of the CRB when it was formed in 1913, he had a quite significant career as a municipal engineer, and I want to talk particularly about the 15 years or so before he joined the CRB when he was city surveyor for the City of Prahran. William Calder was born in 1860 at Lovell's Flat, near Milton on the South Island of New Zealand. His parents were Scottish immigrants from Aberdeen that arrived in New Zealand only the previous year. It was pretty early days for settlement in the South Island of New Zealand. His father was employed in a variety of different work, including road construction, contracting work in Dunedin, and the year after Calder was born, there was the first discovery of gold quite close to where his family were living, and his father gave away contracting and began carting produce and so on and supplies and things to the goldfields for a period, then went back to contracting. And it was said that during that early formative period, that early period was very formative influence on William Calder, watching some of the work that his father and his uncles were involved in constructing roads and so on. After schooling locally, he went to Otago Boys High in Dunedin, and then Otago University. He began an engineering degree in 1881, but he doesn't appear to have finished it. In 1883, he passed the public service exam and joined the New Zealand Government Survey Department as a cadet surveyor. He spent the next 4.5 years doing practical training, everything from drafting to all aspects of field work. And after graduating, he spent about 6 months with the Survey Department before upping stakes and heading across the Tasman to Melbourne. Melbourne was a great place for young surveyors in the late 1880s because we were in the middle of a land boom, and so the surveyors were certainly in demand, both within the municipal councils and also a lot of private subdivisions going on and railway construction and so on. He worked for a period with a couple of private surveying contractors, and then in April 1889 he got a job as assistant surveyor with the Footscray Town Council under John Holliday, who was another New Zealander who'd actually come across a few years earlier to build Melbourne's cable tram network. Holliday only lasted about less than another 12 months at Footscray before he resigned to take a position to oversee the construction of Victoria Docks, and William Calder had already proved his competency and was immediately appointed as a successor to John Holliday. So he spent the best part of a decade at Footscray before joining the Prahran City Council in December 1897. Now, it was a plum job for a municipal engineer or surveyor because Prahran was the second wealthiest council in Victoria after the City of Melbourne. It had some of the poshest suburbs of Melbourne in it, wealthy citizens, and it had pretty good infrastructure and public transport. You see on this early plan of Prahran, it's bisected by two major railways that were built in the 1860s and 1870s. In the 1880s, cable tram routes were opened up along Toorak Road and Chapel Street, which were significant, as we'll get to shortly, because of the woodblock paving along them. And later during the decade that Calder was there, some of the earliest municipal electric trams in Victoria were established also in the municipality. Also, the Victorian Railways inaugurated the first motor bus service well, certainly in Victoria, probably in Australia in 1905. Operated along High Street from Malvern Town Hall to Prahran Town Hall and Railway Station. It wasn't successful. The service was withdrawn after about 6 months, repeatedly because the surface condition of the road on High Street was too poor, and the bus, having solid rubber tyres, didn't provide a very comfortable ride for passengers. A month before William Calder arrived at Prahran, the first, what's widely believed to be the first motor car arrived in Australia. Australia's largest manufacturer of horseshoes and horseshoe nails, John Pender, imported this small hurtled motor buggy from Max Hurtle in Chicago. It arrived in November 1897. Today it's in the collections of Museum Victoria under my care. The year after William Calder started at Prahran, a young mechanical engineer, Herbert Thompson, designed or completed the construction of a prototype steam car, the first steam car built in Victoria. In 1900, with a cousin, he took the car up to Sydney, and they undertook a fairly arduous overland trip from Bathurst, driving the car back to Melbourne. The first overland car trip really done anywhere, interstate car trip in Australia. On the wave of the publicity from that successful outing, they launched Australia's first motor manufacturing company, and they set up business in Herbert Thompson's engineering works in High Street to produce the first production run, a really serious attempt to produce cars on a production basis, and they were small runabout steam cars. They built about a dozen over the next 3 years before they finally gave up for a variety of reasons. That's a whole other story which I'm not going to go into today, but it's certainly a fascinating story in its own right. I've just included this photograph here because I really like it. It's taken probably about 1910. A.W. Hinton established himself in Izzet Street, Prahran, just off Greville Street in 1890 as a coach builder. By the early 1900s, he'd gained a number of prizes at local agricultural shows and so on. But he found himself in the thick of a transforming transport era. By 1905, he was offering to fit and repair pneumatic tyres, a sign of the times, and by 1910 was also manufacturing motor car bodies and doing motor car repairs and so on. So you see this nice transition from the motor vehicles to the horse-drawn vehicles outside his workshops here. It was very much indicative of that period that William Calder was at Prahran. Now, just to backtrack a moment, I need to talk a little bit about road construction technology. During the 19th century in Victoria, there was two main methods of road construction, referred to typically as Telford road construction or macadam road construction. They were both pioneered by two Scottish engineers in the early decades of the 19th century, and they had a lot of similarities. They were the first sort of modern scientific sort of methods of road construction, really, certainly in British-speaking countries. The main difference was that the Telford method began by forming a foundation of closely spaced pitches or spools of hard stone to form a firm base, and then a number of layers of broken or crushed rock and screened and graded rock would be laid and compacted over the top of that firm base, and then capped off with a sealing coat that into which was rolled toppings and screenings to form a hard, impermeable crust. Now, macadam's method of construction, which developed just a few years after Telford's, was a little different in that macadam didn't feel you needed the hard stone base. So he started by just rolling coarse broken stone into the subsoil foundation and then building up similar layers and topped off with a hard crust over the top. Both of these methods of construction typically used hand-broken stone, and there was a theory in the early 19th century that the stone had to be in the form of cubes, as you see in that image there on the left. And it seems to have persisted right through until, certainly when Calder was at Footscray in the 1890s, most of the road construction material he was using there was hand-broken stone, and even when he got to Prahran in the early years there, a lot of the material was being supplied by contractors as hand-broken stone. I think some of the engineers were although mechanical rock crushers had been available since the 1860s, there was a feeling amongst many engineers that they didn't break the stone evenly into these nice even cubes, and that was too irregular. In actual fact, once the stone was screened and graded, mechanically crushed stone was perfectly fine. The photograph on the right just demonstrates early construction of macadam-style roads in one of the suburban streets of Melbourne. So by the late 19th century, macadam road construction was most common in suburban areas. There was two basic forms. They were referred to as dry-bound macadam or water-bound macadam, and the main difference was with water-bound macadam you sprinkled the different layers as they were laid down liberally with water and bedded it down to help consolidate and harden the layers. Dry-bound macadam just relied on spreading the layers and then rolling them into the surface. Prahran had been one of the first councils in Victoria to invest in steamrolling technology. It was a very important part of road construction. They bought their first steamroller in 1875 jointly with St Kilda Council. That roller was worn out by the late 1880s and a second steamroller was purchased. And by the time Calder got to Prahran, the second steamroller was pretty much worn out, so in 1901 he convinced them to purchase a new Overland Porter 10-tonne steamroller, similar to the one shown in this illustration. And most importantly, a year later, he got the council to purchase a Morrison patent scarifier, which you see here attached to the rear right-hand side of the roller, and it became very important because this piece of equipment was used to dig up the old roadbeds. So when Calder came to rework all the roads in Prahran and reconstruct them, the scarifier attached to the steamroller was an essential tool. One of the early tasks he busied himself on when he arrived in Prahran was just general street cleaning and maintenance. He had a number of carts, horse-drawn carts, as you see like on the left-hand side. By the turn of the century, there was about 80,000 horses in the Greater Melbourne area, of which about half were in the inner suburbs. And it's been estimated that each horse would deposit from 6 to 7 tonnes of manure on the city streets each year. So you can imagine there was an awful amount of horse manure that had to be collected up. So each suburban council would have a small army of these street sweepers that would go out and daily sweep the streets and often wash the streets. Calder also introduced the water carts on the right hand side. He'd used these previously at Footscray, and they were built by Eblings over at Yarraville, and they were used both for washing down the streets after sweeping, but most importantly during the summer months they followed the practice of watering the streets to keep the dust down. In 1880, just to backtrack a little bit, in 1899, William Calder convinced the council to purchase a tar distillation plant, which you see in the background here, which was installed at the council depot in Clara Street. This was important because the council had been laying tar pavements back as far as the mid-1870s for footpaths. They weren't using tar for road surfaces in the 1890s, only for footpaths. And they typically sourced their tar in barrels, as you see in the photograph there, wooden barrels from the local gasworks, typically the South Melbourne Gasworks. By 1900 they were using about 40,000 gallons of tar a year. And one of the things William Calder realised with his work at Prahran was the importance of quality of materials and consistency and so on. And with the tar, the raw tar that came as a byproduct from the gasworks, it included a lot of water and also lighter, more volatile oils, which tended to evaporate once the tar was laid and caused problems with its durability. And the way around that was to actually distill the tar to drive off the water and the finer, lighter oils, just leaving the pitch and the heavier oils, which would set into a nice hard body. So that's why he needed a still. So that was an important investment. He was the first municipal councillor to invest in that sort of equipment. Down on the lower right-hand side, you see road construction gangs mixing broken stone with tar from the tar still before they were spread on the roads. I'm going to have to skip on a bit, otherwise we're going to run out of time.
I mentioned earlier on Prahran had cable tramways from the 1880s. This was important because the cable tramways introduced woodblock paving throughout a lot of the inner city suburbs of Melbourne. Woodblock paving had first been used in Sydney in 1880 by A.C. Mountain, who was the city surveyor up there. And the following year he left Sydney to come to Melbourne and take up a similar role with the Melbourne City Council. And he then introduced the technology in Melbourne, and he became a close friend and colleague of William Calder's in later years. And he was instrumental in convincing the Cable Tram Trust in Melbourne to use woodblock paving to line all of the cable tramways in Melbourne, of which there was about, I think, 80 miles or something at the peak, including the two main thoroughfares through Prahran, and that was a major advantage because it was a nice, hard, firm surface. They initially used red gum, later periods they used jarrah from Western Australia and some of the more durable New South Wales hardwoods. William Calder found that woodblock paving could last up to about 20 years in service, and then it could be lifted and then remachined and turned over and relaid effectively. So it's quite durable. It did tend to get slippery in wet weather, so he developed a technique of painting or spraying tar of the surface and then spreading sand, and that was done annually, just to give a little bit more grip, particularly for the horses on the surface. In 1906, William Calder headed off on an overseas trip to the UK and Europe. Ostensibly he went to purchase a refuse destructor, which you see on the right hand side here, which is a large industrial incinerator basically, and that was to solve the council's problem of household and business refuge and all the street sweepings and so on they were collecting, most of which was organic matter and could be burnt. And so this was the preferred technology of the day rather than landfill tips. And Prahran was one of the first councils to invest in this technology. He headed over by steamship. On the way to England, he travelled through Europe and managed to inspect a whole range of engineering works and street construction and so on in many of the major cities in Europe. After spending about 2 months visiting about 20 destructor plants across England and Scotland and various manufacturers, he selected the plant the council needed and ordered it, and then he spent the rest of his time actually studying road construction and municipal engineering. He came back via America full of knowledge and ideas. One of the first things that he looked at was introducing asphalt road surfaces, and they had been widely used in Europe and Britain by this time. The whole problem with road construction technology these days is a lot of the terminology that was used in the early period has been completely confused in the latter part of the 19th century. So today we don't really distinguish between tar and bitumen and asphalt, and everybody regards it as more or less the same thing. But in the late 19th century, asphalt was a natural product. It was a naturally occurring limestone that was impregnated with bitumen. It was largely mined from areas of northern France and Switzerland, and a little bit like mining coal from an underground seam, and then it would be crushed and screened and bagged and so on for export. It had about 15 to 20% of bitumen naturally in the material. So when finally crushed and heated and was applied hot and rolled, it formed a nice hard compact surface which was extremely durable. And in 1907, after he got back from the UK, he convinced the council to lay a quarter-mile section of natural asphalt in Commercial Road in Prahran, which you see here on the right-hand side. The top left-hand corner is the macadam surface in the 1890s that road previously had, replaced by this nice smooth hard asphalt. It was the first surface of that type to be laid in Australia on a road, and proved to be extremely durable. However, it was quite expensive. That's a cross-section of it. The reason why it's expensive, it was only a 2-inch thick coating laid over a 6-inch concrete slab, so it needed a very firm foundation, and that was, it made a significant cost. It cost about 8 shillings and 6pence per square yard or something to install, which was significantly more expensive than most other road construction methods. It was installed by a company called the Neuchatel Asphalt Company, who guaranteed its life for 20 years and had a contract to repair it. In 1909, Prahran and Malvern got together and formed the first municipal tramways trust in Victoria. This was significant because they ripped up the whole length of High Street and Glenferrie Road to install the electric tram tracks. And although Calder was not directly involved in the construction of the tram tracks, he was obviously periphery to the project and an advisor. And he managed to convince the Tramway Trust that they should lay the whole of the route of the tramway with tar macadam surfaces. And so that's broken. So in the macadam process, the top couple of layers, the broken rock would be mixed with distilled tar and then compacted and sealed and so on. So this is the part of the surface that was laid for the tramway there. And that's the construction there along High Street, the finished product down the right-hand side. You can see a pretty impressive pavement. He also laid a section of woodblock paving in High Street on part of the higher trafficked area. I'm just going to skip on a little bit here. In 1911, the tramways extended along Dandenong Road. Again, a significant amount of reconstruction of the roadway was done by all the adjoining councils, including Prahran, and they used tar macadam paving. Part of the work of William Calder was, as I was saying earlier, about getting the best quality materials for his work. In 1909, he convinced the council to purchase their own quarry. There was no good quarrying material available in Prahran, so they purchased a site in Brooklyn where there was an existing quarry, and they used that for the next several decades to produce road construction material, pitches and curbing, and even building stone was produced from the quarry. It was quite successful, it ran profitably, like most of Calder's enterprises, these sort of side enterprises, to produce, and the primary reason was to produce good quality materials at a good price. He's not satisfied with what had previously been offered by private contractors. This is at the council depot. He also instituted a team of horses which were used for the street refuse collecting, and day labour was introduced to do a lot of the construction work and to run the refuse collecting and so on, which had previously been done by private contract. In 1912, he introduced a small, called a motor roller. It was actually steam powered. It was a 5-ton roller with a tipper tray on the back, specifically to be used in his tar macadam construction works. It was built by Jake's Engineering Company in Richmond. The following year, he got the council to purchase a second 12.5-ton Overland Porter steamroller. So you see here at the top the steamroller plant that they had at Prahran by the time Calder left. The main reason why they invested in all those extra steamrollers is he'd significantly increased the amount of road construction that was going on. By 1909, when there was a survey done of Melbourne municipalities, Prahran had the third largest area of tar macadam roads after the Melbourne City Council, the CBD, and South Melbourne. But over the next 4 years before Calder left Prahran, he managed to increase the amount of tar macadam roads they had in Prahran by 5-fold, and literally by the time he joined the CRB, he had become Australia's foremost expert in the construction of tar macadam roads, which he saw as the way sort of a future road construction, particularly for motor vehicles. So I'll just finish off here. I did have a couple of extra sites, but we'll skip those ones. So with him joining the CRB, he would go on to work as the head of the CRB until his death in 1928. He played a key role in innovating with the CRB in construction techniques and road construction methods and so on. By 1946, Victoria had more tar macadam roads than all other Australian states combined. So that was, in a sense, part of the legacy of Calder, the development of what really became the modern roads of our automobile age. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. A fascinating and enlightening presentation on the legacy of Calder and really touching on the whole matter of design and engineering disciplines, really. Urban design, material science, mechanical design, all sorts of things. So amazing, fantastic. Any questions? We've got a very brief moment before morning tea for a question or two.
You know me, Matthew, Andrew Grant. I just was curious about whether the Calder Highway, so named, owes anything in particular to Calder's legacy, or whether it was just one of those traditional acknowledgements of the contribution of a long-serving public servant, and about which, of course, we can be very cynical. But was there any association about with Calder's work, any particular reason why that stretch of road was called the Calder Highway?
Well, he was intimately involved in its formation. I mean, when the CRB was set up in 1913, its basic operating requirement was to, first of all, he spent 3 years with his two fellow chairmen, his two fellow members of the board, doing an extensive survey of the whole of the state. So every municipality they visited over a 3-year period, they rode, walked, drove a car, horse-drawn vehicle, rode horseback through many, many country roads, spoke to many councils and so on. And the purpose of that survey was to work out which roads in the country areas would become the main roads. So the role of the CRB was to identify main roads, which were then declared as main roads, and once a road was declared as a main road, its initial construction was covered by the CRB, and then further maintenance was covered by the local council. There were other, over subsequent years, there were other classes of roads developed, and the second class they developed was state highways, and they were sort of seen as the major arterial routes, particularly the interstate routes. And so I think when they first set up the state highways in about 1924 or something, there was 6 of them, including the Princes Highway, the Hume Highway, which hadn't had a name before that, but was given the Hume Highway after the explorers. And the Calder Highway was originally called at that time the Northwest Highway. And it remained the Northwest Highway until a couple of years after Calder's death, when I think they saw fit to name it after him. But he'd obviously in that decade or so been intimately involved in the reconstruction and the upgrading of that major thoroughfare.
Okay, we'll have one more question before morning tea.
William Calder and the City of Prahran, the relative sophistication of its road system would have required an extraordinary amount of investment. How much do you think was due to Calder's vision, or the fact that the City of Prahran had someone ambitious driving it, or had excellent council rates?
So it's the way all these sort of road construction work is they required, they relied on loans funding. I did have them in my notes, but I sort of skipped it out to leave time. So William Calder had learned when he was at Footscray the benefit of having a healthy loan account. Because Footscray's in the fortunate position, it was the last council to become a city just before the land crash in the early 1890s. And it also successfully managed to float a major loan of about £30,000 before everything went belly up on the London share market and everything. And that tided Footscray over for the next decade virtually. So Calder sort of spent the next decade spending the £30,000 on road construction and drainage and things in Footscray. And when he got to Prahran, I don't know yet how big a role he had on getting the loan up and running, but in 1889, 2 years after he arrived, Prahran took out 3 major loans. I think they total about £75,000 in total. And so the way rate revenue worked in those days, it was only adequate enough to cover basic maintenance and the sort of day-to-day running of a council. But if you want to do any major road construction work or invest in drainage or new equipment like road rollers or quarries or rock crushing plant, that was all funded out of loans funding. So it was really critical, and I think Calder was very good at working the local politics. So he knew how to talk to the councillors and get them on side. And surprisingly, the sense you get from the council reports at Prahran is that a lot of the councillors were sort of local businessmen and people like that, and they were often surprisingly kind of scungy when it came to spending money, and they'd always be complaining. Like when he went on the overseas trip in 1906, they spent the first 3 months while he was away sort of all quibbling and arguing at the council meetings about why they'd spent so much money sending Calder over to England and how he couldn't possibly get the plan any cheaper than they could have if they just ordered it through an agent in Australia. And
they just clearly didn't understand the enormous benefit of that investment, because he just learned so much in the overseas trip. It really made him as a road expert, because he just opened his eyes to what was going on in the US and Europe and the UK, and came back full of all these ideas, which he then just began to disseminate through Prahran and all the other local councils of Melbourne.
Would you join me in thanking